My name is Joanne St. Goddard. I'm the Executive Director of the Circular Innovation Council, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time. We've got a very, very healthy crowd, one of the biggest crowds we've ever had for any webinar at over 400 delegates today. So really impressed with the interest in the matter that we'll be discussing, driving a circular economy for plastics, and the exciting release of a new plastics recycling definition standard by the Canadian Standards Association. So got a little bit of agenda to go through with you today. We've got a packed agenda, so we'll just get right to it. Next slide, please. So before we begin, we are hosting this webinar today on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Next slide. So we're very pleased to co-host and co-design this webinar in partnership with the CSA, or the Canadian Standards Association Group, who is the author and owner of the standard that we'll be focusing on today. CSA Group has been involved in the Circular Innovation Council for many years, both in terms of a supporter of the work that we're doing, but also in general in our support and mandate towards accelerating a circular economy in the Canadian context. They are a champion partner of ours for our marquee education and engagement program called Circular Economy Month, and are also one of the leading sponsors for our upcoming April 2025 Circular Economy Summit scheduled in Montreal. So we thank CSA Group for the partnership and the support for today's webinar, and we're very excited to dig into the standard itself. So just by way of today's agenda, as I mentioned, we have about 90 minutes to cover a lot of content. So we're going to introduce, after our introductions this morning, and I go through a little bit about who CIC is, if you're not a member and we haven't had the pleasure of meeting you. We'll dig in a little bit about our organization and what we do. We'll talk a little bit about standards in the context of its role in accelerating a circular economy, and then I'm going to turn it over to the lead from CSA Group, Michael Leering, who is a board of directors member of CIC, but is going to help us walk through some of the key attributes of the standard itself. And then we've protected some time for a panel discussion, which will include 4 key stakeholders that have been involved in the study and get their perspectives in terms of their experience of co-designing it with other members of the advisory committee, as well as those that are in the market today managing plastic materials to understand how they may use this standard in the marketplace and within their own organization. We're going to protect some time to open it up for questions for all of you in the Q&A function of the webinar. And then we actually are going to take a few minutes to feature Jean Couteau from BNQ, who's going to talk about a complementary study that they have recently released as well, and how these standards will work in collaboration with the standard we're featuring today. We'll protect another 20 minutes for a fulsome round of Q&A with all of the speakers and panelists, as well as yourselves, and then we'll close and wrap up with some closing information as well. So that's today's agenda. Moving right forward into About CIC. So we're a non-for-profit organization that is working to reshape Canada's linear economy and accelerating the development and adoption of the principles and practices towards a circular economy and all of the social, economic, and environmental benefits that come with that new design. We are a growing organization with a new national mandate and are membership based with more than 200 organizations, reflecting the wide diversity of the sectors and stakeholders, both in the private and the public sector, academia, etc. And we work really at the cross section of 3 pillars of action: supporting and advocacy work on effective markets-based regulations and policies that help shape markets towards circularity, developing resources, research, and services that again support both private and public sector in unlocking the innovation and new frontiering work that is necessary for us in the transition to a circular economy. And then using all of that intel to develop programs and pilots and partnerships that move concepts into action, where we are trialing some of these new solutions that we are working on in research and resources, and to apply them in the market, grow them from pilot projects into permanent programs and practices as well. So if you haven't heard of the organization and you're not yet a member, we really welcome you to get to know us a little bit more and consider membership and partnering and working with us. Next slide. This is just a really quick logo swoop slide that gives you a snapshot of the diversity of types of organizations that we work with that are encompassing our membership. We're very blessed with a wide-ranging type of organization, again, both in the public and the private sector, that work with us in a variety of different fashions, and have in their own right made commitments themselves towards transitioning to a circular economy, be it at a product level, at a systems level, at an organizational level. So very blessed, and again, welcome you to consider joining us. Some of you may be familiar with our programs, resources, and pilots. They are diverse in nature, and again, the point of these resources is to try to really unlock the 5 enablers of a circular economy: collaboration, information, data, which we are going to be talking a lot about today, policy work, standards, and the like. So we really work in a variety of different sectors. We work in a variety of different business models and product and systems. Most importantly, all of what we learn in the work that we undertake is made open source for anyone who wants to understand the learnings and to apply them in their own situations. So again, circularinnovation.ca, if you've not had the chance to spin through our website, we welcome you to do so. So I thought we might start with just situating you in why the Circular Innovation Council cares about standards and why it matters in the context of accelerating Canada towards a circular economy. So we thought it important to sort of just pull out some of the really key points in reminding us why this matters. And we know that recycling is a key element of the circular economy, offering new value to reuse discards, particularly in the plastic sector, while reducing our dependency on virgin materials and the resources, and of course avoiding the negative impacts that come with virgin inputs. Policymakers introducing regulatory performance requirements such as recycling targets also need a mechanism to validate compliance. Standards offer a critical tool to do so. Standards also offer common language to define recycling claims, as well as consistent methodologies to measure and report them out, ensuring market fairness and full transparency. And markets and technologies for plastics recycling, we can all acknowledge, is an ever-evolving and maturing industry. And as such, standards are now essential for both the private sector and the policymaker. And of course, we know the diversity of plastic resin types, their divergent uses and applications in the market, as well as their global, that should say, commodity trade requirements. Standards are really necessary in order for us to level market playing fields between us domestically and internationally as well. And so if you've had the chance to read our co-authored Circular Economy Action Plan, standards really, and the enablers that unlock a circular economy, standards are really important in the 2 areas that are shown here, that are pulled out in terms of information, as well as policy development as well. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about a really exciting set of speakers that we have brought forward today, we're going to start with Michael Leering, who's the Director of Environment and Business Excellence at CSA. He's going to, as I mentioned, walk through the details of the standard itself. And then we have 4 stakeholders who were very much either involved in the development of the standard itself or will be intending to leverage it and use it in the marketplace, starting with Dr. Christina Seidel, who is not only the owner of Sonavera International Group, was in fact the chair of the technical committee, so played a pivotal role in pulling together the divergent groups or stakeholders that were part of the technical committee, but really helping to assemble their views into what is now a very useful and powerful document. David Lynch, the managing director and owner of Get Green Solutions Incorporated, who will be looking at it from a chemical or advanced recycling perspective. Arjan Krishnan, who is the manager of a closed loop program and sales at EFS Plastics, who's a really important and growing mechanical recycler in the Canadian context and abroad. Mr. Neil Menezes, Packaging Sustainability Policy Manager at General Mills, who can bring forward historical, operational, and technical know-how with how plastics moves through the recycling value chain, but then the vantage point of understanding how standards can be leveraged in this regard related to being a brand holder and potentially the supply chain, as well as an obligated producer who is managing compliance rules and performance standards across the globe. And then I mentioned Mr. Jean Couture, who is the program leader at the Bureau de Normalisation de Québec, BNQ, who again, we're at the helm of releasing a complementary standard on recycled content. So without further ado, I think we will move into asking Michael if he could come live and present information. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. I really appreciate that. Just to confirm, you can hear me, see me okay?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
All right, well, I really appreciate it, and I wanted to share just good morning or good afternoon to everyone that's able to join us, depending on what side of the country that you're on. I'm really very thankful for everyone being able to join us today for the launch and the discussion related to our new plastics definition of recycling standard. I also really wanted to thank my fellow speakers today and the committee members for joining the discussion to bring you, I think, really a holistic, 90-minute program where we kind of can have the opportunity of diving into a lot of the details. I also, at the outset, wanted to thank the Circular Innovation Council for your leadership and hosting this webinar and making all of this possible. So with that, let me maybe just proceed right through into my slides. I'm going to try and keep this to 10 minutes. I want to start by just clarifying and out of the gate a few slides with regard to the Canadian Standards Association, or also known as CSA Group, which is our organization. The CSA Group, or the Canadian Standards Association, we're a not-for-profit that's been really focusing on keeping Canadians safe for over 100 years. And we're comprised really of two main organizations: our not-for-profit Standards Development Organization, which is really shown on the left, and our for-profit test and inspection and certification organization, which is really shown on the right. And I think many folks and my friends recognize CSA from our commercial side, our iconic brand on hockey helmets here in Canada, work boots, or household products that come with the CSA certification mark. But really today we're here to talk about our not-for-profit standards development organization that I come to from, that really focuses on social good. Within this standards organization, I do want to highlight that, we not only lead and are the largest standards development organization in Canada, but we also invest heavily in research, education, and advocacy. And I think, especially as it relates to plastics recycling and the standard that we're talking about today, we've really leveraged a lot of the research program within this discussion. And I think today is also another example of our advocacy effort. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. I wanted to also clarify that the Canadian Standards Association is also a membership-based association at our core. So we really are supported by over 11,000 expert volunteer members that come to our committee tables to help us draft and write the standards that we publish. I often hear that, people think that CSA writes standards. And I think it's more accurate to note that we actually facilitate the development of standards by convening expert members from diverse perspectives. And it's our role to make sure that we have balanced representation between the quintessential user interest categories. And that's really the role that we play and the role we've played here in the plastics definition standard. We operate across 14 areas of focus, which includes my area of environment and climate change, natural resources, but we also operate in construction, health and public safety, electrical, renewable energies, just to name a few. But we really do help to support almost every single economic sector in Canada. We operate 1,000 technical committees that support the publication of over 3,000 standards and codes. So with that, let's go to the next slide of I guess, overview and I guess table setting for the standard development itself, which I think is important for again, just context setting. And so really, what are standards and why are they important? We often explain that standards are agreed upon ways of doing things to achieve a common purpose. So they really are guidelines that establish the acceptable practices, the technical requirements, terminologies for many of our diverse fields that we operate in. And I think the most important part is that all of our standards are built by consensus from technical experts. Standards do set these best practices and they really provide clear requirements so that all can apply these requirements consistently. And I think that, again, is no more true than in plastics definition standard we'll focus on today. I also wanted to highlight as well a really important point of National Standards of Canada is that they are required to be continually maintained. So CSA Group, as an accredited standards development organization, we're required that at a minimum of every 5 years that we review and update all the published standards that we have. So this plastics definition standard that we'll be discussing today will have its own life of its own and will be continually maintained as we now move forward. So with that, let's maybe go forward. And I wanted to then just kind of dive into more of the heart of today's discussion on plastics recycling and definitions. And I wanted to start by highlighting that the standard itself and the publication of the national standard has actually been really many years in the making. And as mentioned earlier, we do have a major research function. And within this discussion, we really did leverage our research program. We made two meaningful investments in research. And in 2020, we published a first paper titled A Roadmap to Support the Circularity and Recycling of Plastics in Canada. And then from that first paper, it had many findings, which I'll speak about in just a second. But we then moved and we invested into a second research project, and it was published the year after, and it was titled Defining Recycling in the Context of Plastics, a Principled and Practical Approach. And that was published thereafter. And we also saw even external papers, like Eunomia's report that I think Joanne also highlighted, the comparative assessment of standards and certification schemes for verifying recycled content in plastics. And all of this led really to the establishment of the CSA Technical Committee at the beginning of 2023, where we started the work on the actual national standard itself. So if you want to go to the next slide, I wanted to just quickly highlight these key publications and the findings of each. And first, in 2020, our roadmap found many things aware in how standards can help support circularity of plastics within Canada. And it noted that there's needs to adopt common definitions for recycling and terminology to support that consistency at all levels for industry and government. So then we dove deeper and we invested in a second research paper. And the second research paper really provided an actual suggested definition of recycling for Canada, which is important to the plastics recycling sector. And it really set that foundation of technical background. And that second research paper more specifically was given to our technical committee as the basis as we started to develop our national standard of Canada. Again, Eunomia had a very similar report, but also came to the same conclusion. So if we go on to the next slide, all of this kind of summarizes into the fact that, time and again, we realize that there is no consistent definition of recycling in Canada. And this is really a barrier to understanding and comparing recycling rates and processes across Canada. So with this barrier, we established the technical committee and started to develop this national standard. And I think now that it's published, we're really excited about the application it may play in many of our areas. The definition of recycling can be important to both public policymakers that are seeking to achieve specific environmental outcomes associated with recycling materials. It can also be of importance to the plastic recycling sector itself, and it'll help to determine the plastics collection, sorting, recycling, supply chain design, and infrastructure. And it also can help support recycling targets under EPR programs. And setting these targets requires that clear, consistent, unambiguous definition of recycling for producers and verifying and achieving the targets that are in question. So with all that context and setting, let's maybe continue on and go to the next slide, and I'll just quickly explain the scope of the standard itself. And this is where I kind of excited to kind of dive into the details of the standard itself. And as I've already been speaking to, this national standard really at its core just simply aims to set common definitions of recycling to ensure consistency in the use of this important term. We found and we think that, everyone has an understanding of what recycling is, but the standard more specifically and technically defines where and how we should be measuring recycling across the various recycling methods, to make sure that we can have a common and consistent outcome from these measurement points. So the standard includes guidance on the required of what information also should be reported alongside any published data on plastic recycling. But I also wanted to make a mention and a note that the standard, our standard, CSA standard, it doesn't specify the ratio of recycled content in plastics. And on this, I also wanted to kind of highlight and thank Jean Couture from B&Q for being able to join us today. He'll be able to provide more information on their related program and certification of recycled, the ratio of recycled content and products. So there is kind of a differentiation between the CSA and the B&Q standards, and I'm excited to have Jean speak to that in a little bit more detail. So with that, let's move on and continue on to get to the heart of the discussion. And more specifically, I want to also kind of table set for the discussion that we'll have with all of our panelists coming up. And that is, like, more specifically, what is in and out of the standard related to plastic material itself. And this was a really important part of the committee process and the consensus building. And the diagram on the right really, I think, lays this out pretty clearly for what's included in terms of materials. It really shows basically that plastic from any sector is included within the definitions of this standard. So that kind of encompasses a lot of different materials, but it's also then important to note the exclusions. So the standard excludes anything related to biodegradable plastics. It also excludes like other components that are often associated with plastic material, such as things like inks, glues, coatings. Like, these are also outside of the standard. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that lastly, the standard doesn't refer to toxicity of materials at all. So our standard can't be used to determine if something is categorized as hazardous waste or not as well. But that's figure one taken right from the standard. And if we want to move to the next slide, I also wanted to table, without further ado, the ultimate definition of recycling that the technical committee members landed on. And in speaking with the chair, and Christina's here with us today, well, I understand that really early on, there was agreement that basically recycling is recycling. And that's kind of regardless of what material we're referring to or discussing. And the definition, therefore, really refers to the process and what the process really is. And the definition that you see in front of you, it really then stipulates that recycling is the processing of waste materials to make secondary materials from which new products are formed. So this is kind of the definition, but again, there's some very important exclusions and clarifications that go along with this definition. And the committee agreed that anything that ends up as fuel is not included in the definition of recycling. So waste to energy, energy recovery, like, these are not included as recycling. And there's also exclusions for reuse. And although reuse is very important, and actually we're developing a series of national standards to support reuse, reuse itself is actually outside of the definition of recycling. And I'll maybe remind everyone of the 3 R's: the reuse, reduce, recycle. And noting that, firstly, we try to achieve a reduction of waste itself, but then secondly, try and reuse things. And then thirdly, recycle. So again, like reduce, reuse, and recycle, they're kind of different systems. And recycling itself, as we're talking about recycling, it's a little bit different than reuse. And we are, again, trying to advance reuse systems in Canada as well, which I'll speak to just at the end. So with that, let's maybe go to the next slide and dive just a sliver deeper. And this is as deep as I'm going to get. But from this overall definition, it then becomes a question of, again, like, where and how are we going to measure the recycling across just the various recycling processes? So this is a bit of a complicated slide, and I don't want to go into too much detail here. This is figure 2 from the national standard. But I want to include this to kind of show the various methods of recycling and processes and highlight for you the CP, and the CP refers to the calculation point. And amongst all these processes and recycling procedures, there's many measurement points along each of these pathways, but I wanted to use this figure of the standard really to show the calculation point. And the calculation point is defined within the standard as the point in the recycling process at which material is deemed recycled. And as you can appreciate, there was a lot of discussion and deliberation within the committee to build consensus on where these calculation points were within each of these different processes. And they landed on these calculation points as points really, I think, in the process where the members felt the most comfortable that material would be processed into secondary materials and new products. So this was the really important consideration when setting each calculation point and making sure that it aligned with that preceding definition that I explained. So really, it's one thing to define recycling, which we've done, but then also how do you measure it and where to measure it was really, really important. And that's really what this figure helps to clarify and what the standard is overall looking to do. So with that, let's maybe go to I think my last slide. And I just wanted to, in closing, I wanted to first and foremost thank and acknowledge the kind financial contributions from the Standards Council of Canada that helped to support the development of this national standard. With that support, I also wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this national standard is freely accessible to all in Canada. And it is accessible right at our CSA Group store. So within the CSA Group store, you'll see a little button that says View Access, and clicking that, having a simple login, you'll be able to review the standard in its entirety at no cost. Again, this standard is going to be maintained on a 5-year cycle, so it'll be continually updated within its publication cycle. And again, I just want to reiterate some of the other pieces that we're mobilizing to support circular economy overall. And again, we're developing a series of national standards on reuse and reuse standards in collaboration with Resolve and PR3. And we're also doing a lot of work and efforts as it relates to the international committee and the international standards on circular economy. Right now, we're in the process of adopting these 3 ISO standards into Canada. Not only, again, like ISO 59004 on common vocabulary and principles on circular economy itself, but importantly as well, ISO 59020 at the end about measuring and assessing circular economy within its performance. So that, I hope, sets the table for the remaining of the discussion. But again, I just want to kind of take the opportunity to explain how we go about developing standards, and then also what this new national standard kind of includes at the outset. And with that, Joanna, I'll turn it back to you to kind of get into the heart of this even further still with industry experts that we brought today.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. That's a lot of work in a very short period of time. I invite you to keep your camera on, actually. Just mute if you would, but keep your camera on because I'd like to include you in this broader panel discussion as well. And I invite Christina, Neil, David, and Arjan, if they wouldn't mind, to turn their cameras on and again, unmute yourself so you're able to talk. So I introduced you very, very, very briefly at the beginning. I invite you now as a panel, maybe starting with Dr. Seidel, to introduce yourself and maybe just reiterate your role in the standard development, in this particular standard development. And then for others that maybe weren't at the table in the technical committee, talk a little bit about how it relates to how you might use it as an organization and where you see its use in the market more broadly. So thanks, Christina. I'll start with you.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. And thank you very much, Michael, for doing such a good job of describing the monumental task that we actually undertook. So I'm Christina Seidel. I'm with Sonavera, but a lot of you I know from the 30 plus years I spent as executive director of the Recycling Council of Alberta. But I was very honored to be the chair of the technical committee for this standard. It was a very interesting process, and I would say it's a critical process. It was a task that really needed to be undertaken. And I have to say, CSA did such a good job of assembling the right group of stakeholders to actually do this. And as a result, we actually ended up, I truly believe, with a very robust outcome, which wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had the participation of all of these stakeholders. So we had stakeholders from all walks of the important components. So we had regulators, we had obviously recyclers, but we also had producers, and we had other people from industry as well, and we had academia. So we really had a very broad range of stakeholders to be able to bring the different aspects to developing this standard of the definition. And it was very, very, I think as a result, it ended up being very, very positive and also very robust, as I said. So the outcome in terms of the definition is, I think that's what we can be really proud of. When I look at that definition, and again, looking at this broad group of stakeholders, what was amazing is when they sat down and started talking about putting together this definition, it was amazing how quickly everybody came together. And yes, the CSA standard process is one of consensus, but the input of the different stakeholders was very consensus oriented. And as a result, everybody was really very positive in terms of trying to come together to produce this standard. And if you look at, Michael went through the actual definition, and if you look at the definition, I think what's so interesting about it is truly agnostic. So as much as the standard is intended to be within the scope of plastic recycling, when you look at the definition of recycling, it truly is agnostic. So the being able to step back and say, okay, recycling is recycling, and here's our definition, but then how it applies to plastic recycling, I think that's how it ended up being really as strong in the end as it was. So again, a very, very positive process, one that I was very proud to be part of. And yeah, thanks again to all the stakeholders for being so productive and positive in this process. So Joe, I'll turn it back to you then, so you can pass it on to the next panelist. Thank you.
That's great. So I'm going to go through all the views first, and then I've got hopefully some juicy questions to ask each of you, having sat through this process with you for some time in developing the standard in the technical committee. I think I know where some of the salient points are. But Neil, maybe I can ask you to unmute yourself and talk about it from both your technical operational acumen and experience, but looking at it from a producer's perspective as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And again, I want to echo Christina's comments, Michael. It was a great pleasure to work with CSA on developing the standard. I think from our perspective, obviously General Mills is not, as a brand, we're not in the recycling business. We are the ones that are designing the packaging that is being introduced into the market, and we expect it to be managed in an appropriate way. And what we found is working through the provinces where there are EPR programs, they all track it just a little bit differently, which kind of makes it challenging to understand whether the investments we're making to make our packaging recyclable is actually ending up and getting recycled. So I think that's where we see the standard. We are not, from a realistic perspective, we are not in the recycling business, so we're not going to say this is the standard we will use. And we don't really work directly with recyclers at the end stream, so we probably can't even get our vendors to say this is the standard that we want you to use to track your information. But we recognize we play a critical role working with producer responsibility organizations that are in the business of working with service providers and ensuring that the materials are being recycled appropriately. And we think this is a way of harmonizing it across Canada. We are likely going to go through some iterations because we're going to see some fluctuations or some variances between how provinces and how service providers actually track their information. At least this gives us a starting point to see what are the efforts we're doing in terms of moving to more recyclable packaging, what impact it's having on the market. And then we can decide, does that need more support for us from our design team, or does it need more support from us to working with service providers and our pro to make sure the materials are being recycled? Because it's a huge investment to move to recyclable packaging. The last thing we want to do is have this material end up in the exact same spot as the non-recyclable materials.
Yeah, and I would imagine as an international brand holder, there's probably a rarity that Canada may be ahead of the game as it relates to where the US is in the revolution of EPR legislations and the role that this might play. Maybe Canada is going to be using this standard to sort of set the course, if you will, for what's to come in the United States as well. And so that's, it's an important and impactful place for us to be.
Definitely. And I think the other part, and it's always fun working on both sides of the border, is the US EPR likes to leapfrog both the Canadian and the European. There's a lot of requirements around responsible end markets. So this is a standard that we can now look at in the US to make sure our materials are going to responsible end markets. We probably won't, it still needs to be adapted for the US, but it's a good starting point to see how this works in Canada, and then how do we build on it or cater to the specific European or global markets.
Super. Thank you very much for that. David, ask you to do the same. Unmute if you can. Just remind us, the organization that you work with and your role in the standard development itself. And maybe because I know you come at it from a chemical recycling perspective, which is a tremendously evolving and maturing space, a lot of new investment, a lot of expectation built up around chemical and advanced recycling. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you think this standard can be applied now in the place that the marketplace that chemical recycling is now and plugging into, and where you see it might be its application into the future as it evolves.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so for those not familiar with me, my background, I've got about 30 years of new product and new process development. Much of that is in the circular economy space, developing new ways of taking waste materials and turning them into new products that fit directly into the supply chain. So the way that this standard really helps the industry is, firstly, it sets a foundation for defining what is recycling and how to calculate how much material is being recycled. One of the things I like especially about the standard is the fact that it applies to stakeholders across the circular economy ecosystem. So whether you're a plastics manufacturer or a brand owner, or a manager for a municipal or provincial jurisdiction, this allows you to actually measure how much material do you have, and how much material is actually being recycled. Even recyclers can measure how much material is coming into their facility and how much material is coming out of that facility as a recycled material. So you've got efficiency calculations and things of that nature. So the standard does a really good job of addressing the needs of many stakeholders. And of course, it's not perfect. I'd say the chemical recycling aspects were some of the most challenging aspects in developing the standard, really because it's not a fully mature industry yet. It hasn't been around nearly as long as, say, mechanical recycling and some of the more standard recycling methodologies. And we wanted to make sure the standard was applicable to all of the technologies, anybody in the recycling space. So that was really a challenge. So the way that we set the standard up now is that we've got provisions for what is a recycled product. Your plastic, for example, doesn't need to go right back to plastic in order to be recycled, but it does need to be a commercial product, something that's sold for reuse within the chemical supply chain or the plastic supply chain. The big exception, as was pointed out earlier in the presentation, is that fuels are excluded. We wanted to make sure that a material, is plastic can be burned, waste can be burned, and many of the intermediates can be burned. So we wanted to really make sure that we're focusing and enabling the reuse of those materials in the circular economy so that they won't be burned, they'll be reused. And that was really one of the key developments in this. So I think as we go forward, not only can you build on kind of the mechanisms that we've put into the standard for determining what's recycled and how much, but we've also made allowances in the standard so that as these chemical recycling technologies continue to evolve, they continue to develop standards around what is a recyclable product versus what's a fuel product. The standard very much is able to accommodate that and basically allow those recyclers to take credit for the recycling that they're doing, whether that's an oil that's going into a cracker or whether that's some other kind of a chemical that's going into industry for reuse.
Thanks for that delicate dance that you have to do to try to make it useful now, but anticipate where the chemical industry is headed into the future, but still leveling that playing field and to ensure fairness. If there's one sort of takeaway for me and my learnings in being part of the technical committee, that was an incredible and laudable achievement of the standard itself. So thanks for those inputs. Arjan. Now, I'm gonna preface my comments because, in all fairness to you, you are not part of the technical committee necessarily, so weren't sitting there for this multiple months and almost year and a bit of the development. But nonetheless, a very big and important mechanical recycler in Canada and beyond. And so we'd be remiss in not having your inputs in terms of, receiving the standard, going through it, having a look at it from your operational and market knowledge. Can you sort of answer the same question that David did in terms of how do you think that EFS can use the standard now for its customers for compliance and EPR, but thinking about where the evolution of mechanical recycling will be into the future?
Yeah, so a great question. I think I'd first like to start off by introducing EFS for those that don't know of us. EFS Plastics is a mechanical recycler. We've been around since 2007, processing locations across Canada and the US. We're a polyolefins recycler, so we recycle polyethylene and polypropylene plastics, and we recycle plastics back into a plastic application. Now, to answer that question, I think we read through the standards and we think that it's a very much a step in the right direction. One of the things that we've had challenges with, over the last 17 years is being recognized as a local recycler, because oftentimes a lot of the feedstock that we would be looking for would be going overseas, and that was a huge challenge. Over the years, we've been seeing this shift and recognition for a local plastic recycler, and this sort of works towards that. So very much appreciate it. Appreciate the work that was put into it. In terms of the standard itself, I think there's a huge opportunity to use it to have discussions with pros, with the transition that we're going through across the whole country. And I think we can use the standard as a way to for measuring, and I think it becomes once it becomes consistent across every province, reporting becomes a lot more easier, I'd say.
Really important point. Just given the dearth and scope of everybody who's really defining themselves as a mechanical recycler, what is recycled and what is a recycled product is not necessarily the outputs from the recycling facility. It's really when it is truly an inbound or an input to a remanufacturing product. So making those delineations and leveling the playing field, even in the mechanical or physical recycling world, is critical as well. Okay, so as I had anticipated, with a crowd as large as we have a bit of a deluge of questions here. I'm going to try to grind through them as best as possible. We are running a little bit behind time, so I just want to give assurances to all of our guests that if we don't get to your questions, which we're very likely not going to do in this first set of Q&A, maybe in the second, we will commit to you that we will get an answer to all of you through email. So the first one, why are biodegradable plastics excluded from the standard? I'm looking at maybe Michael and or Christina, if you could give us some context around that. Whoever wants to try to talk about
I can maybe jump in and just maybe know, Christina, and I was not part of the technical committee. I was not part of the deliberation or discussions. But Christina, as I understood it, I think biodegradable pieces were excluded because I think it's a different technical expertise that maybe needed to be leaned upon, and not necessarily the membership that we put together that focused on plastics and plastics use, plastics recycling specifically, was really the specific focal point. So I think, Christina, maybe you can elaborate from there in, but I think it's just a matter of being specific with what the scope was, and the scope was agreeable to looking at just plastics itself. And there's further complexities with biodegradability. And I don't know if we had the requisite level of expertise within the committee. So that's why I think there was a consensus that, that was excluded from this thing. But Christina, maybe you can help us better understand. But that was my benign understanding to date.
Yeah, sure. And certainly biodegradable plastics were one of the more controversial discussions that we had as a technical group. There was a lot of discussion, and you're right, Michael, a lot of it has to do with the scope. So biodegradability is less about recycling than it is about other things like composting. So as a result, it doesn't, perfectly fit within the scope of this particular standard. Now, that doesn't mean bio-based plastics can still be included. The origin of the plastics is definitely captured. But if the intent of it is to be biodegradable, then that was agreed that was not really recycling. So as a result, that falls outside of the scope of this standard is the bottom line.
Super. Thank you for that clarity. Next question. Does CSA R117 cover plastic liners in compost bags or compostable bags themselves? There's a massive disconnection between compostable products and how they are treated in the waste transfer stations. So you know what? I think what I might ask you to do, Michael, because this is outside of the real guts of what we're discussing today, if I could ask you to take a hold of that one. I think you have access to type an answer to that. Can I rely on you to sort of tackle that one as we're getting through this? Another one, need to understand what reuse of material means in terms of exclusions. So another one around exclusions, can you provide examples? So reuse, the definition of reuse versus recycling. Again, Christina, do you want to try to take this one? I've got the standard in front of me if you want me to read the terms, if you remember.
Yeah, and Michael actually referenced this. There are separate standards being developed for the definition of reuse. So this, stay tuned. This is going to be covered. It's not covered within the scope of this standard, which is why it's excluded. In no way is the exclusion intended in any way to suggest that it's less important. I would say the opposite. It's recognized as highly important. It just doesn't fall into the recycling standard. So there will be reuse standards coming out. So stay tuned.
And is it fair to say that we think about reuse of materials and revaluing them in processes for recycling, and its reuse as a product is typically how, in my mind, I kind of delineate the two. And I think the reuse standards that are to come are more of the latter. Is that right, Michael?
Yeah, I think so. And Joanne, maybe this is a great opportunity to plug the Circular Innovation Council pilot in Ottawa, right? Like when we think about the fact that reuse systems, right? Like we're talking about, plastic-based containers, but those plastic-based containers that don't go in a blue bin and get picked up at your curbside, but rather get picked up in store and brought to a professional washing facility and reused specifically. So that's kind of why I mentioned like the 3 R's, right? The reuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's actually like a commonly well-known phraseology, right? And the 3 recycling arrows. But it's actually important to recognize that that's actually a prioritized list. First, you got to reduce, then you've got to reuse, and then recycle. And I think, Christina, keep me honest here, but I think that's some of the delineation here is that when we're talking about recycling and recycling plastics, that's a little bit different than reuse systems and reuse standardization. And again, like to reiterate, we're developing a series of national standards on reuse systems. That includes a national standard on washing requirements for reusable containers, collections, labeling, and all those different touch points, right? Because as the Circular Innovation Council is proudly piloting in Ottawa today, we have this whole network that's required for a reuse system. And I think, we got to decouple that. I think the committee decoupled it from recycling because recycling is going back into new products. Not to say like you can't have a piece of recycled content of plastic that goes into a reusable container, but I would just maybe suggest for the audience today, they're different cycles. And I think reuse is preferable to recycling because it's a direct one-for-one, repurposing of the materials without having to deconstruct it and reconstruct it into a new secondary product. So I hope that maybe helps. And Christina, again, keep me honest here.
And Joanne, if I can just jump in really quickly, This is why the standards are so important. that we misuse a lot of these terms. So that the challenge is people tend to use the term to talk about the same thing. So often they'll use reuse when they really should use recycling. Where does reuse begin? When does it become recycling? That's why we need standards, so that we are using these terms properly. And that's what this is for.
Exactly right. One more question I think we can take before we move into the next part of the agenda. And maybe I'll shoot this to Neil first and then open it up for anyone in the group. How does the new definition relate to or affect EPR programs for plastic packaging?
I think that's it's a good question, and I think the long-term goal is as there's this national harmonization across the EPR programs to get them harmonized in terms of what information is collected from producers, but also from service providers. We think this becomes a starting point so we can see the effectiveness of each pro's activities in the province and then adjust accordingly. Because if one is lagging behind, then you have the ability to say, all right, what's working well in one province versus the other. So again, I think as kind of Michael indicated earlier, this is still a voluntary standard. So it's going to take time for adoption. People need to understand what the new reporting and the definitions are. So at least we can have this information being reported, and then we can make the appropriate adjustments in terms of investments in the provinces.
Yeah, and I guess by extension, there's always this desire to harmonize. Harmonize means different things to different people, but harmonize can be a supporting scale, and we know scale supports cost reductions or cost mitigations. And so, do you think, Neil, by just a step two to that question, that there's an opportunity here to use those standards to try to build scale, so that recycling in one jurisdiction means recycling in another jurisdiction, and so then you've got these leveling off, if you will, of applications and processes, and maybe seeing some common costs?
Definitely, I think that's kind of where we see the greatest opportunity is that once we start getting better handle, because there's so much data out there, and there's always conflicting information. So this tries to remove that noise and provide a level playing field for all the different stakeholders. So not only can producers understand the recovery performance, but even service providers can understand where there are deficiencies to build that scale. Because you don't want to build a facility that can handle, say, 100,000 tons, but you realize there's only 50,000, and the economics of that doesn't work. So having good data, a standard data set nationally is going to drive, I think, much more targeted investments to grow recycling in Canada.
Yeah, which I would assume by extension helps the EFSs and the chemical recyclers of the world understand where to invest and when to invest in their own facilities to be able to accommodate the synergies.
Exactly.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, that's great. So we're right on cue now. And I'd mentioned, so please keep your questions coming. I know as you think of them, please drop them in the Q&A. We will filter through them in one way, shape, or form. But I just want to keep to the agenda here. And as I mentioned, there is a complementary study standard that was developed, and I sat on that technical committee as well. So was blessed to be part of those conversations, and just as rich and dynamic, I think, as the ones for the CSA standard. So we want to ask and invite Jean to give us a rundown of the study, of the standard itself, and I guess really focusing on how and where you think it's complementary to the standard we're discussing today that CSA has posted.
Thank you, Joan. I would like first to thank CIC and CSA Group to give me the opportunity to present briefly our national standard on recycled plastic content products and our BNQ organization. In the meantime, I would like also to take this time to acknowledge the financial support from the Standard Council of Canada, Environnement Canada, as well as Éco-Entreprise Québec, Environnement Québec, the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, and Recyc Québec to make this certification program possible. Next slide, please. Since 1961, B&Q services include the development of standards based on consensus process and internationally recognized methodology as well as certification program. We offer about 88 certification services based on ISO standard, Canadian or national standard, and standard developed for Quebec in order to meet the needs of more than 2,000 different industries. The BNQ is also involved actively with ISO to management and participation of various committees such as Canadian mirror committees. Next slide, please. During development and writing of the standard on recycled plastic content product, the following references has been used by the standard committee, which I was not part of it at that time. We use a lot of different ISO standards, like the one for the chain of custody, the one for environmental label and declaration. And that time, there was a draft of the CSA R117 that was available and look at the standard development in the committee and our general rules of procedure that we use for any our certification program. Next slide, please. Oh, well, even if the technical committee has used a draft version of the CSA standard, there is some similarities between CSA and BNQ standard from some aspect like definition and calculation point, as shown on this slide, and many elements already mentioned by Michael. In the calculation of recycled content, I think it's important to note that plastic reclaimed through the same transformation and manufacturing process without any additional thermal treatment will not be included in the calculation, as mentioned in our standard. Next slide, please. The purpose and the scope of the standard were mainly tracing of recyclate entering the supply chain, establish the requirement for third-party verification of recycled content claims, recycled content marking and labeling of the product, and also establish the basic requirement for classifying a product based on its origin and treatment. I should mention that this standard does not apply to sorting center, but it involves their participation in ensuring the conformity within the requirement of this standard by establishing a management system to ensure traceability and authenticity of plastic feedstocks. Next slide, please. Given like we mentioned before, given the great diversity and complexity of all existing plastic, the recycling technology could be devised in two approaches. One is mechanical recycling, which is a kind of physical process that consists of shredding, grinding, washing, separating, or pelleting to produce recycled plastic. And also there's chemical recycling technology that we can group under, let's say, three main process families, which is purification, depolymerization, and conversion. That includes various processes like using solvent, heat, enzyme, or microwave in order to purify or break down the reclaimed plastic and create polymers, monomers, oligomers, or hydrocarbons product. Next slide, please. In this standard, the marking of the product is not mandatory for this certification. However, when the organization wants to add marking, it shall be conform to the requirement of CSA ISO 14021, and whenever it's possible, it shall be printed permanently and legibly on each and every recycled content product. The recycled content shall be expressed as a whole number with a minimum guarantee claim round down to the nearest unit increment. In our standard, we ask to have at least 5% of a recycled content in any product to be able to be certified them. For the packaging, the information that shall be printed on the recycled content product may also appear on the packaging itself. Almost the same type of marking is allowed. Next slide. So what is the purpose of this certification program? Because we're talking not only at the B&Q of a standard, but a certification program that include the standard, the protocol, the certification protocol, and the requirement. So in order to establish the certification requirement, we must verify the conformity of recycled plastic content in end products according to the requirement of the standard CAN B&Q that we have published last year. Our certification program is based on our general certification rule document, of course, on the standard itself. And this certification process is valid for at least 2 years and include one B&Q visit per year at the manufacturing site. At the bottom of the slide, you can see an example of the mark of conformity that if the manufacturer would like to print, must comply to this one. Next slide. So during the B&Q inspection at the manufacturing site, our inspection will verify that the organization will provide the required evidence to demonstrate conformity to the requirement specified in the following document. The requirement of the standard, of course, the requirement in the certification protocol that define how and when B&Q will verify those requirements, and also the requirement related to the quality management system at the manufacturing site. Next slide. So again, I would like to emphasize that there's a lot of similarity between those two standards in many elements, and also mention that CSA and B&Q have other collaboration in development of standards like carbon intensity of hydrogen and Canadian hydrogen installation code. Next slide. So what are the challenges that we are facing now? One is the collection. Vast majority of plastic packaging and products used by consumers and businesses in Canada today are never recycled or very little. Most of the plastic ends up in landfill. Another point, sorting. The sorting is done mostly manually, and new technology will need to be part of the solution if we want to increase the capacity of sorting center. Same thing for recycling technology. We need to have new technology in order to recycle different kind of plastic and increase capacity economically. And of course, national policies. Government must mandating the use of recycled content in plastic product, and industry must embracing this shift from a linear economy model towards a more circular one. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jean. Again, I'll ask all of our panelists to unmute and camera on, please, because we're going to go into the final and biggest portion of the agenda that for live Q&A. So again, keep your questions coming in. I see we're seeing, again, lots of them, but just to sort of riff off of Jean's presentation, I think it's incredibly advantageous for both the private and the public sector to see these two complementary studies really almost come to life at the same time. I understand there's a bit of awkwardness in the sense that we've got a recycled content certification, which has, you know, definitions that are part of it already in terms of what is considered recycling, before we have the CSA definition of plastic recycling and how to measure that. So a bit of a sort of a chicken and the egg reality there, but there is tremendous opportunity to align these in the marketplace. So maybe what I'll do is just on a practical basis to challenge Jean and to Michael to talk about uses from your perspective and how they might work together for both the private sector and then maybe the policymaker. So I'll start with you, Jean. You did call out some areas of supply chain, of procurement requirements, but where do you see both the standards being leveraged for the private sector now?
That's a good question. I think we really need to have some national policy, because otherwise, let's say, if I'm not, if I don't have to do it, and it costs me some money to do it, I won't do it for sure. So if there's a policy that's forced the industries and the population and so on to do recycling, I think that will help a lot to obtain our goal.
So I know we're all waiting in that regard for the policy advancements or challenges that are happening at a federal level, but we do have
Yeah.
EPR tools that are live today, that are evolving today, that do have performance requirements, do have a desire, I think, for brand holders to start to look at the discards that are collected under EPR as input. So I think policy structure.
We have visited some of the industries around in Montreal and Quebec City that do some plastic contains, and what they said when we asked them if they would like to be certified, they said, of course we will, but if we are not pushed by any
Regulator.
policy, not really. Some of them told me exactly that they are waiting to see if there will be a Canadian policy for plastic content recycling.
Especially if there's a preferred, there's an additional cost.
Costs, exactly.
Part to PCR, you have to build that scale through policy to bring those.
Yeah, and what is my plus value to be certified? You know,
right.
Will give me more businesses or not. If give me more businesses, well, I'm willing to do so. But
there you go. So shout out to General Mills. You've got to put it in your supply chain requirements. If we want to really make this, in the absence of policy, this is one of the mechanisms that we can really use is to make it a requirement.
Yeah, it's coming from the industry.
Supply chain for sure. Michael, any comments from you?
Yeah, and Joy, let me also just even expand the question and just highlight the fact that I think there's a lot of questions in the Q&A about, the participation or reference by regulation and government representation. So I have answered some of them, and let me also reiterate, we will get all these questions. But I'm really pleased to say, we did have a lot of representation from provincial and federal departments. We had Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, BC, we had, Environment Climate Change Canada, all as members and participants within the process. But, as it then relates to, well, is this standard regulatory or is it required by law? I need to, highlight for the audience today that, the standard was published on Friday. So it was published just on November 22nd. And I think, we really want to emphasize the value I think it can and will play, or we hope it to play. But certainly today, as we launch and explain, this final publication, what consensus was reached, I think it's going to take a little bit of time to figure out where and when and how this will fit into regulation, policy, and landscapes. There certainly is a lot of things coming forward. Environment Climate Change published their paper, the recycled content and labeling rules for plastics, the regulatory framework paper, and all the requirements that are coming in. So we all know collectively that, plastics pollution, plastic waste is a problem in Canada. We need to continue to get better. And again, I think the standard is going to be playing an important role, hopefully within policy, but all standards when published are voluntary until such time as they're referenced in legislation or regulations. And I also just wanted to clarify as well, like we always hope and intend that the embodiment of the whole national standard will be referenced in regulation. But governments could also reference aspects of it. Maybe they reference the calculation point, but maybe not, the definition of recycling itself. So there's flexibility also on the way that the standard can be referenced in whole or in part. But we always hope to have a holistic adoption and reference of the standard, because again, we really feel strongly that the embodiment of the consensus between government and industry and all those dialogues that Christina led, thank you again, Christina, for your leadership, can really help and strengthen where that ultimate endpoint and calculation points are, and what information also needs to accompany the actual recycled content information itself. So there's a lot of depth here, I think, in the standard. And again, just to kind of reiterate B&Q, like B&Q is a great example of an application. I think, Jean, just to reiterate, the current program that B&Q is running references the definition, I think, from the CSA research paper. So now as standards evolve and mature over time, it's hopeful that in the next 5-year revision cycle, potentially, B&Q's technical committee themselves can look at this national standard and can potentially, continue to move towards it. So there's many different ways that it could play a role. And I think, having just published it on Friday, we need to wait for that deliberation to take place.
Do you think, and I know there's sort of one of the questions that I saw come through in the Q&A was sort of akin to this idea of having a third standard around what is defined as a recyclable. And I thought that was an interesting sort of trifecta. Yeah. So I don't know what you feel about that, if that's something that's in CSA or in B&Q sites. But there's lots of claims of something to be recyclable, and we all know the machinations of what happens when that claim hits the marketplace, when products are made globally and recycling really happens locally. How do you wrestle with that? So what do you think?
Yeah, and let me maybe jump on that one, and then Christina, I can turn to you for further context, because it's coincidentally enough, Joanne, this is something that we've been discussing even in preparation for this launch, and other, I guess, gaps in the plastics recycling marketplace, right? So we're really focused on this recycling process and looking at the different procedures and methods of recycling itself. But way, way, way upstream, as we develop plastic products, we need to look at, what I think is referred to in our first publication, that roadmap. That was another major finding, Joanne, was design for recyclability, making sure that the plastic products and the properties of them are as such that they'll fit into the mechanical and other separation processes down road. And I think, the realization in the first publication paper for that roadmap also flagged that as a major issue as well, as far as like designing for recyclability. So now we've defined recycling and where and when, but even the products itself, not all of them even fit in that. Some get kicked out of the process as not fitting in within the procedures. And I'm not the best person to speak to that, but I did just want to highlight the fact that, even preceding this definitions of recycling piece, like the design for recyclability, was a major focal point as well. So we have been looking at that. We may continue to advance standardization in that recyclable definition. Is it recyclable? And Christina, Arjun, I don't know if either of you guys have anything to add to that, but it is definitely on our radar. It's from 4 years ago we published that kind of that need as well.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I think, Arjun, I'd love to hear your take on this, because I can tell you, and we talked about this, Michael, this is something that the recyclers themselves want. We need to define recyclable. I mean, in terms of design, that is such a key factor. And how in the world do the producers actually know if something is recyclable unless they have a real definition to be able to look to? So I think, I'm hoping, Michael, that might be one of the next things CSA looks at, because it's certainly something in the recycling field that is needed. But again, I throw this over to Arjun to hear his take on this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at it, strictly from a polymer perspective. And if I were to use an example, if I were to go practical and use an example, polystyrene is technically a recyclable plastic. However, it doesn't necessarily have, as many end markets. It doesn't have as many mechanical recyclers. Mechanical recycling has been going on for 3, 4, 5 decades now. And there are mechanical recyclers today that can take it and process it and convert it into another polystyrene product. So then it becomes like a gray area. Technically, it is recyclable, but is it actually being recycled? And then that's a question mark. How do you and then do you wonder, if policy can help out in that, by saying, listen, if you use a certain percentage of recycled content, then perhaps it drives, it creates circularity. It ensures that plastic is in fact recycled, and then for sure it is recyclable. But I wondered if it made sense, to look at it from an individual polymer type, and even going down to like a PET. Technically, a PET plastic is recyclable, but for a large part, it's the clear plastics that get recycled and not necessarily the opaque ones. What do you do now? How do you where do you place that in the grand scheme of things? So I just feel like there's so many more factors that comes into play, and um, it certainly requires a lot of perspectives, before we decide, okay, what, this is recyclable versus this is what is actually happening on the field.
Thanks for that. Really great dialogue, and I invite others to sort of chime in as well. I'm thinking about the Competition Bureau's new labeling laws, sort of try to set a threshold in terms of the percentage of materials that are actually collected locally, and that threshold, and I can't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but I think that's attempting to try to put some rigor and rules around what can be labeled as recyclable. So that is sort of bleeding over to a standard. It's certainly setting a threshold. So work has been done in that regard. I don't know, Neil, David, any comments from you? David, you got your hand up, please.
Yeah. No, just in terms of what's recyclable, when you look at chemical recycling, there's a broad range of raw materials that can be recycled through chemical recycling. But the challenge then becomes how much of that recycled content is actually making it back into the products. And so, again, you've got a chicken or the egg situation. And it's really, really important that if somebody's saying something is recyclable, they kind of have to walk the walk and actually be using that recycled content or some recycled content in the manufacturing of their product.
And then I remember the debate about, well, does it have to displace virgin in the case that, we've answered the question yes, or can it be used as downcycled and replacing other materials? And I remember, Christina, that was a pretty live debate in the technical committee discourse, for sure. Anything from you, Neil, in terms of this conversation around a standard for recyclable and what that might mean for General Mills?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think in principle there are standards out there. There is the Associated Plastic Recycler, APR's standard and design for what would be considered recyclable. There's also the Golden Design Rules that kind of provide guidance in terms of what is recyclable. So I think there is a sense from industry in terms of what is needed to make a packaging recyclable. I think the other issue, and I think this is where it gets kind of challenging, with EPR spreading across all of the provinces now, and I think we expect every province to have EPR by the end of 2025. The issue happens, how do you build the infrastructure to recycle the material if it's not recyclable today, and then you say it's not recyclable? You go into this perpetual, like, I can't build the infrastructure if we are told and it doesn't hit that specific threshold, and say the threshold is 60% and we are 55, and you say it's not recyclable. How do you ever get the next 5%? So do you now throw away 55% of it being recycled? So I think that's some of the challenges that, because EPR is still being added in Alberta, is being added in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, those provinces and existing provinces are going from shared to full responsibility. We want to be cautious in how we define. There's a design for recyclability where we know it can be recycled, but the infrastructure may not exist today. So how do we give it time to build the infrastructure to manage it? So I think that's recyclable gets into a really tricky area, and it's hard to put a standard other than recognizing there's usually 3 buckets. Something to be widely recyclable, it's gonna be above a threshold, something to be in a transition phase, and then some we know are just incredibly challenging, and the resources needed to build the infrastructure, it just probably infeasible. So those are the general 3 guidelines I think we as a corporation kind of work with, is you can fall into one of the 3 categories, and putting things into just those 3 categories in 2 buckets becomes challenging.
And so important for policy to think long term, in that regard. So leading, giving time for the industry to make the investments where they need to make them. And, whether it's CapEx or OpEx, they
Yeah.
need time to be able to make those. And really for us to be honest with ourselves to say, well, if there are materials that are just never going to be defined as recyclable or be accepted in recycling processes, be they mechanical or chemical, are we then moving up the hierarchy to avoidance and prevention and reduction? And we
Right.
got to sort of face those realities, and that's why the hierarchy is there, and that's the way it's written, why it's written as a hierarchy, for sure. Okay, so I'm in the unenviable position of a frozen Q&A slide. We've got, I think, time for one last question. May I ask I don't know, Michael, if you have access to it, maybe I could pinch it to you. I think we're just overloaded with numbers here, but happy to ask you to call out one more, maybe for the group, if you don't mind, and for me.
Yeah, there's a lot, and I guess I'll note that we need to loop back with folks, and I continue to answer these. Yeah, there's a lot of I guess questions that we could ask. I'm just trying to wonder if we're limited on time. I guess maybe there is one that was looking at changing the public distrust. During the development of the standard, the question reads, was there any discussion around how the standard will or can be used to change the public's distrust in product claims of recycled or recyclable? And maybe that's a good discussion that we can have, because I think as I maybe tee that up, and maybe I'll jump in on it, like, again, I think one of the foundational challenges we've had is like, where and how can we measure the recyclability or recycled, content? And I think with time and time again, research showing that there's no common and consistent definition, especially nationally. I think it's really important to start to move and also build public trust on what a common definition is. So I certainly think that this standard helps to support movements in the direction towards building public trust, but even just consistency in it, and making sure that reporting is consistent, I think, is really important. Because right now, especially as you get into advanced recycling, the calculation points are complex. And I think it's of value to having brought together an experts to really crunch through and chat through. And Christina, maybe that's your segue to talk about the discussion points of the committee. But again, like, that's why I get so excited about my job and our work, is that we don't write standards, and people sometimes think we write standards. We don't. We facilitate the development of it with those that we're looking at here, the experts within the field that live and breathe this every day. So Christina, maybe with that, you can maybe add on to that. But I think
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because the public trusts standards more than they trust individual producer claims. So that's one of the roles, I think, of standards like this, is that there is going to be more trust in the outcomes. So I think it's one of the real values, that if it actually meets the recycling standard that has been developed, that is going to be, for sure, there'll be more weight put on that than an individual claim that somebody might just think is greenwashing. And it's a problem for the producers as well as consumers to be able to actually know who they can rely on in terms of what these things mean. So I really think that's one of the strong benefits of the standard.
And we need consumers and residents, people that are participating in blue box programs and recycling programs, to utilize and optimize those programs. And so trust is so critical. We always talk about, we spend a lot of money on promotion and education, the producers certainly do, to try to optimize and maximize those programs. And if you don't have public trust, and if you're not incenting, the optimum recycled content or recyclable products, then you're not pushing the market in the way that we want to design it as well. All right, we've come to the conclusion. Thanks for pinch hitting for me there, Michael. I think we've got a couple of slides, and maybe while Caitlin's getting those ready, any last comments, burning things that are in the back of people's minds, things that we may have missed here? Yes.
I've got one. Well, I noticed there's a question, and thank you, Audrey, for answering it. So it's now in the answer section of the questions. But there's a question about the cost of the standard being $150, and noting that I did make commentary that it was freely accessible. And I just maybe to clarify that point, certainly the standard is freely accessible to all using the free access platform and system. You will need to log in and have a login, but the standard is accessible to all at no cost. But maybe the nuance and differentiation is that downloading the standard and having an offline PDF copy does come at a cost. So I just wanted to clarify that, Joanne, that the standard is freely available for all. Anyone can review and consume the entirety of the content at no cost. But yeah, there is a cost to download and have an offline PDF copy. And maybe just to reiterate therein as well, like we are a not-for-profit organization, and this standard, as I mentioned a few times, has a life, right? So we'll continue to convene these experts and continue to put resourcing and support into this to make sure it aligns with and follows the advancements of this industry, because it's not going to be stagnant. It's going to need to be refined and updated with the technical committee. So any and all of those fees that are collected from any of the downloads support those to come processes that we will continue to support. Regardless.
And before I close off, Michael, I should just maybe ask the question. Many hot off the press, many are just still digesting, reading, combing through it. If folks have, and I know you had a really rich and long consultation process open to the public for a comment, a formal one. Is there a mechanism for folks that are our guests today or others when they're just going through the first time to give you any kind of feedback, and how would they do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joanne. And I think, we're always receptive to feedback, not to be confused with an open process by which the committee is currently looking at the standard. That comes more at a 3, 4, 5 year interval period. But if there is any feedback or thoughts or suggestions, comments on it, I think the best way of sharing that with us is in our general email inbox. And we do have a general email inbox set up that is environment@csagroup.org. So it's pretty easy to remember, but also even myself, my email is michael.leering@csagroup.org, and as is all of our staff here that are with us today. So if there is any feedback, we're always welcome to it. Christina, we will certainly be sending anything in your direction, because we operate in the means by which we convene the technical committee, and any comments that we receive will be going to the technical committee for consideration. And again, probably held until we do a formal revision or review of the standard, and that could come at any time in his life, but at a minimum at a 5-year mark. It would probably be opening this up sooner than that, though, John.
Great, that's great. And I'm assuming same for you, Jean. I know that your standard is a little older and has been around a little longer, but I'm assuming that you're always open to feedback as well.
Yeah, always.
Cool. Great, that's good. So with that, first of all, thank you very much to all of the panelists for giving of your time, your expertise, and your energy to the presentations today, as well as the dialogue, and making yourself so open to take on these questions. I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet, because you can see that we still have a dearth of questions that we have to grind through, and so I may be back at you to pull in some of your expertise, but with sincere thanks from the Circular Innovation Council for your time today. We really appreciate that, and thank you, Michael, for sponsoring this webinar, as well as the other works of the organization, and your team is brilliant to work with. Just a small plug for our circular economy, the Canadian Circular Economy Summit that we co-own with the CELC. More of these discussions about information, standards, data, transparency, market assurances are going to be part of the discourse, and take a lot of real estate up in the agenda. If you don't know about our summit, early bird rates end on Sunday, and we first come first serve at 300, and I think this morning there were 12 spots left at the early bird rate. So if you haven't registered, please do. There's a bit of savings for you there. If you want to know more about the summit and get involved, more than happy to chat to you about that. We are welcoming, we hope, over 800 people to the event in Montreal on April 15th, 16th, and 17th. And we really look forward to, now's the opportunity to give us ideas in terms of how to shape that agenda, but really appreciate the opportunity. I think my team has also put in a small survey link, or a link to a small survey, pardon me, and a QR code here. If you would mind taking 2 minutes to let us know two things. How did it go today? Did you get value out of this? Was it worth your time? How can we restructure it, and how do we improve in the future? We're always in a mode of continuous improvement. And then coupled with that, what else would you like us to cover in terms of these information and engagement webinars? It's always a big part of our mandate in terms of bringing stakeholders together to discover and to dialogue around best practices. So we really want your input as well. And a last shout out to become members of the organization. We welcome you all. And we're as a rich an organization as our membership base is. So please, doors open. Any questions or comments for myself, Joanne at circularinnovation.ca. Again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all the delegates that bothered to be with us today, and look forward to working with you all. Take good care.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.